Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Thought Leader Roundtable. Today is the third installment of a three-part series exploring the strategic approaches of the Forum for Youth Investment's work. Karen Pittman, our co-founder, recently transitioned out of organizational leadership to a senior fellow role to find more time. With a national search underway for our next CEO, the Forum's mission and vital work continues to help leaders think differently about what it takes to manage and sustain change so that they are more motivated to act differently and ultimately act together as part of an allied youth-serving field. Those who know the Forum know that we have three strategic approaches that have guided our work since our founding over 20 years ago. Those are strengthening practices and programs, improving and aligning policies, and planning and partnering for impact. Karen is sitting down over the past month with the Forum's three program executives to discuss how the Forum is changing the odds for young people and explore the future of our work to advance equity, research, policy, and practice across all the systems and settings that shape young people's lives. Today's session features Thaddeus Ferber, Executive Vice President with the Forum and co-founder of Spark Action. Thaddeus leads the Forum's work focused on policy and strategic storytelling. We will be accepting questions and comments via the chat feature on today's session, which is available at the bottom of your screen. Today's session is being recorded. Next week, it will be sent to everyone who registered and also posted to the Forum's website, along with any resources that are shared. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Ian, and welcome those who are on the call with us. Excited to be able to jump into this third part of the conversation with Thaddeus Ferber, who has been with the Forum really since its inception, and has just been a critical part of the work that we've been doing. I asked Ian to leave the screen about the three approaches up just for a minute to remind you that in each of these conversations, what we've been doing is to sort of dig into what we've done over the past couple of decades that really sort of allows us from an entrepreneurial way to work on these themes. There's been a steady push in all the areas, but the strategies, the projects, the initiatives have been different as we respond to different times. So we're going to dig in today with Thaddeus. We can take the screen down so we can see Thaddeus up on the screen fully. And Thaddeus, given that you have really spent almost your entire adult life with the Forum, tell us why you have made this incredible commitment to this organization.
I believe I made a one-year commitment and then another one-year commitment and then another one-year commitment. And somehow it's now been, I think it's right around half my life by this point, depending where you start the clock. I'm definitely the only person I know who's still on their first job out of college. So not such a common thing in this day and age, let alone other days and age as well. I mean, I think you'd have to go back to my childhood to really see why I ended up in a place like the Forum and why it's been such a great home for me and my work. So I grew up, lots of advantages. I was in a leafy suburb, good public school system. High school switched to a private school that looked pretty much like any New England college would look like. But at the same time, I was tutoring a third grader named Dominic in the inner city school system in Dorchester. I was reading Savage Inequalities. I was reading There Are No Children Here. I was listening to Street Soldiers. And I was always keenly aware of how different my reality was from so many other people's realities. And yet at the same time, you know, when those other kids in high school somehow just didn't seem bothered by this, or at least not nearly as bothered by it as I was. I think for a number of them, and even a number of the teachers, there was kind of this sense that racism was a thing from the past and people now don't have a racist bone in their body. And so what I was thinking about and writing about at the time is what I called unconscious racism. I was trying to explore how fellow white people could feel they don't have a racist bone in their bodies and yet somehow seem perfectly content to live within and perpetuate a racist system that was put in place by our forefathers. And that latter is, you know, become now known as structural racism. But I was really trying to grapple with those concepts and really make some sense of the two realities that I was seeing. And then came Rodney King. So this is March 3rd of 1991. He was beaten by LA Police Department officers. He was struck with a baton 56 times. And so this is long before there were cell phone cameras, even video cameras were pretty rare. And so certainly people of color knew this type of treatment was going on. For a lot of white America, and certainly for myself, seeing that video was the first time that I was conscious and knew that that was going on. And I think there was for a moment a sense that, okay, this has been caught on video, people are seeing it, change is going to happen because of that. And then about a year later, right about this time of year, it was April 29th in 1992, the rulings of the court cases came back and none of the 4 police officers were convicted as guilty. And then the LA riots began. So that's 29 years ago. I was 17 at the time. There wasn't an internet back then. And so the only way really to learn what's going on real time is in television and newspapers. And I was just glued to the TV screen and had like a huge stack of newspaper articles that I was clipping out of not just what happened to Rodney King, but the deep inequities in South Central LA that now became on the cover of the news. And then later, some of the solutions that people were putting in place somewhere. And it was just not something I could just set aside, I guess. There's a movie, Hotel Rwanda, about the Rwandan genocide. And there's this moment when finally a TV news crew comes and films what's going on, and a local activist said to the TV producers, like, thank God you're here. Now people in America are going to see what's going on. They're going to be compelled to act. And the grizzled old TV producer said, people in America are going to glance up at the television, say, that's a damn shame, and are going to go right back to eating their dinner. I don't know how people do that. Like, I really don't. I don't know how people can watch George Floyd being killed and watch Breonna Taylor being killed and watch Freddie Gray being killed and Adam Toledo being killed and like just go back to picking out couch fabrics or what other ways people choose to use their limited time here on Earth. And so for me, it's more of a compulsion than a choice. Like, I literally don't know how to live life otherwise. Whatever gene it is that people have that can compartmentalize and just go back to doing whatever, I'm certainly missing. And so then the next question for me is, all right, I want to find ways to help. What assets or abilities do I do? What could I offer up in this space? I was severely socially stunted at the time. I couldn't make a friend if my life depended on it. So any type of leadership role was clearly not going to be in the cards for me. But I had a huge number of advantages in my education. Growing up in a safe environment, had access to books and libraries. We had a computer in the home long before that was even a thing. In high school, I got to do an internship with Howard Gardner. So through all these experiences, I've become what I thought of as a good thinker, at least in the traditional Western academic sense of the term. I can research things very deeply, look across, synthesize, make new connections, propose new ideas. And so when I applied for college, I already knew that I wanted to continue to study education. And I actually don't know where I got this, but like I already had a sense that I probably would have been perfectly happy living my career in academia if the research would be used to shape policy and practice, but I had somehow figured out that most of it wasn't. And so, so I applied to Stanford, and on any Stanford brochure or whatever, they have the iconic statue of Rodin, the thinker. And so I wrote my college essay, I wrote, I am above all a thinker, but unlike the statue, I'm not content to rest idle. And so for me, the opportunity to help build an organization that was an action tank, not a think tank, an idea that drives ideas to impact, it always just felt a natural fit with who I am and what I've been trying to do. And so you put those two things together and changing the odds by moving ideas to impact. And I think if in high school I dreamed up what my dream job would be, I think I kind of got it right now. And so that's why I'm continue to be here and committed to staying here. And I just don't think there's any other place right now you can go that's advancing equity in research and policy and practices across all the systems and settings that shape young lives. So here I am.
And we're glad you're here. I really appreciate your taking the story all the way back, even to before I knew you. So going really back into your adolescent years. And I think that's often for all of us, certainly was for me, a pivotal place where you have to ask the question, why are things the way they are and what can I do about them, given my particular assets, personal, social, et cetera. And, Marita had the same conversation and question and, went off to teach in Costa Rica and, taught in Southside LA, and everybody had these experiences. And all of us in the end, looking for that thing we now call an action tank intersection, sort of gravitated towards the forum and stuck here. I think that is when people stay for decades, it is for that reason. But let's fast forward a little bit and talk about the place where you, Marita, and I actually physically met for the first time, which was smack in the middle of trying to bring these ideas into policy. It was the President's Crime Prevention Council in '95 with the Clinton administration, when the idea, which the seeds had been planted more than a decade ago when I was at the Children's Defense Fund, of why do we have all these different federal policies that are, picking at young people from different things, gang prevention, this, that, this, and all of them primarily negative about fixing kids. And how do you really expect communities to put this stuff together with any kind of an approach, asset-based youth development, whatever you call it? And then we got the wish. Somehow, as the '94 crime legislation sort of pushed through, this idea of an ounce of prevention council was stuck into it, and they needed somebody to run it. And the call came that said, you asked for it, you got it. I think that used to be the phrase, you asked for it, you got a Toyota. But you asked for it, you got it. And then we had to quickly pull a team together. And you were a part of that team. So when you think back to where we were a quarter of a century ago in that work, what do you think we've learned about what works, since that dropped you squarely into the middle of where we are now, trying to take all these federal programs and federal agencies and glue them together with a common understanding of what it takes to support youth development? What have we learned?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing and opportunity we have. Milbury McLaughlin at Stanford was the matriarch of the triumvirate who introduced you to Marita and then introduced me to you and Marita back in the day. And I had come, as Marita had, with an education background, and Milbury opened it up for me and broadened the lens and pointed to the work that you, Karen, and Marita were doing. So their bumper sticker phrases: problem 3 is not fully prepared, academic competence, while critical is not enough, competence alone while critical is not enough. And that was just kind of it for me. And so I designed my own major at Stanford focused on that with those 3 principles in mind. Developed a major on youth development and policy. I always knew policy is where I was going to try to push through. If I'd known how hard it would be, maybe I would have picked something easier, but certainly we've done a lot and learned a lot. As I was prepping for this session today, I went back to reread a paper the 3 of us wrote very early in this work. It was in 1998. So it's just a little after the President's Crime Prevention Council, and you said it was handed handed to us, but I kind of think it was handed to us, and then the rug yanked back out from under us very quickly, so we weren't able to actually do what we thought we were going to get the mandate to do. And I'll turn to that in a little bit. But yeah, so when I went back through that and was thinking about what we've learned in it, so a couple things kind of stood out to me. So one I'll say is hearing both me and Marita thinking about education is really exciting, that now we've come full circle and the organization is really digging into education in a way we haven't had an opportunity to do in the past. But what both Marita and I and others found that was working in education is the same stuff that was working in effective after school programs. And I think in terms of our sense that the types of environments that promote optimal development are where young people feel safe, where they feel they belong, and where they matter. The track record things that is we really got that right. After a while, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report, Communities Programs to Promote Youth Development. That was in 2002. They really showed that, yep, those are the things that influence development. The Forums Weichert Center then developed tools to test, are the after school programs that do those types of things well, do you actually learn better? And found to a remarkable ability that is absolutely correct. And now more recently, the National Academy of Sciences put out the promise of adolescence that went a step further and was actually able to explain in brain science why the heck this is the case. So that when you don't feel safe, you don't feel belong, you don't feel you matter, your body releases the stress hormone cortisol, which essentially shuts down the parts of the brain that you need that are focused on learning and memory, right? So they don't drive while drunk. I think the new thing should be don't learn while scared.
Right.
You're literally learning impaired when you don't feel safe and you don't belong and that you don't matter. And part of the SOLD Alliance, the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, is continuing to push forward on this. But in terms of were we right about the types of environments way back when, I would give us pretty much an A+ on that, but it just keeps getting more and more validated, which has been great to see. In terms of then the goal, so the President's Crime Prevention Council, preventing crime, focused on a negative, right? That's where the youth development movement really dug in and said, our goal with working with young people shouldn't be the list of things we're trying to prevent them to do. Goal should be what we should help them to do. And generally people think what we should help them to do is academics. And we said, well, there's a lot more to development than that. So that too, I would say we've had a good track record. And I actually think even in policymaking circles, that really has shifted the norm of thinking. We've done a great job updating what readiness means over time. Great readiness, ready by design, the science of learning of youth readiness, compiled what the current of the state of the art was. The Forums Weichert Center has dug in deeper on social emotional skills. The Readiness Project is driving this forward. We've gotten buy-in at different times from different sectors. Partnership for 21st Century Skills really brought in a lot of the corporate sector. Karen was on the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. So I do think that this notion of it's broader and we need to do a better job of being explicit about what success looks like. I also think we'd give us a very high marks on that one. And then the last one that also give us high marks on is the notion that there isn't like one magic thing. There's no one magic trait that makes you resilient or not resilient. There's no one magic program that if all young people could get this program, then everyone would succeed. And really the sense that it's the preponderance of things. If you have lots of negative things in your environment, it's going to be very hard for you. If you have lots of positive things in your environment, it's going to go better for you. And so I think, Ian, if you put up the next slide, one of the core conclusions that we came to in the unfinished business is that the desired goals of overall youth development are difficult if not impossible, to achieve within the bounds of a single intervention, unless that intervention is in reality not a single program or even a comprehensive one, but a reasonably complex strategy to change young people's environments and opportunity structures. So we wrote that unfinished business on a decade of promoting youth development 20 years ago. And I think if we now wrote further reflections on 3 decades of promoting youth development, I would imagine we would say pretty much the same thing in the same way. But I'm curious, Karen, if that also is what you would say, or you think we would change or amend how we think about this?
Yeah, no, I've had in this time that I now have, since I'm not CEO and haven't been for a couple of months, I really have sort of taken to going back and reading some of our older stuff, and I would agree with you 100%. The ideas are there, and I think one of the things that has allowed the forum to move so effectively from being a think tank to being an action tank is that we really thought well. We got some of the best, most entrepreneurial thinkers. Yeah, you can quit sharing, Ian. We got some of the most entrepreneurial thinkers to join us and push the field to really get it right, get the framing right of what it means to do this. And then we started to move it forward. So I would say absolutely yes. We can either be excited or depressed that we can go back 30 years and pull up a quote and it's absolutely right, and pull out a graphic and it still makes sense. But you can go back longer. I mean, I've just been pulling out Bronfenbrenner. We can go back, and we need to go back to the big thinkers. This is sort of big thinking, and when you think big, and you get the pieces together, and you get it reasonably right, it sticks. But I do think sort of we came out of that, and I think one of the things that we said on the call last week with Rita is, when we then went about setting up the forum, moving from the President's Crime Prevention Council to the International Youth Foundation, where you came on as a fellow briefly, and to start IYF US, and then starting the forum, we got charged with get grounded, get results, get focused, and we had to figure out what that meant. And especially in the policy space, talk a little bit about what it really meant for us to figure out how to work with policymakers and advocates to not just pick one thing at a time. What we just said is it's going to be a complex strategy. You can't just pick one age, one outcome, one system, and zoom in and focus. And one of these days we'll pull out all of our old, sort of PowerPoint decks where we had people literally zooming in and zooming out of these sort of red, yellow, green charts that had age and outcome, and systems, and say, you can't just pick one. Even though it seems simple, you have to do it all. So our first pass at doing that was to say, let's pick up at the state level where we left off federally. We had a table with all of those agency heads sitting around the table, really thinking about how their things fit together. And that was starting to work. It got shut down prematurely, but it was starting to work. How can we replicate that? So talk to us a little bit about the opportunities we had to really replicate it at the state level with the Children's Cabinet Network and other initiatives that have really focused on how we move from those 350 plus different federal programs that come down in bits and pieces to getting people to really think differently, and so that they can act together. Talk a little bit about how we started to move those ideas into policy and into policy coordination.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I give us high marks across the board for identifying what works, I think what we continue to learn and grow about is, how do you deliver what works at scale when what works is a reasonably complex strategy, right? Putting in place a reasonable complex strategy is complex to do. And we've tried lots of things. Some have worked, some haven't. I think there's plenty of room to still grow with that. So I remember in the President's Crime Prevention Council, one of the core papers you and Marita wrote really broke down into some basic who, what, why, where, when questions that communities need to ask themselves. And at that stage in my kind of growth and development, I was frustrated because I wanted to know what were the answers. We can tell people to ask the right questions, but shouldn't we tell them what the answers are of what works? And I still feel that like a little bit in me. One of the things, actually, I think this is the next slide, Ian, that came out of the collective impact movement was looking at complexity and complexity science, I think it is called. And this came back to help answer for me the why at the President's Crime Prevention Council, we couldn't just tell people the answers, we could only tell them to ask the right questions. So they said, under conditions of complexity, predetermined solutions can neither be reliably ascertained nor implemented. There's no single solution to these problems, and even if a solution were known, no one individual or organization is in a position to compel all the players involved to adopt it. Important variables that influence the outcome are not and often cannot be known or predicted in advance. Under these conditions of complexity, predetermined solutions rarely succeed. So this for me kind of went back to answer for me the question why at the President's Crime Prevention Council, we can just tell communities what to do. We could only tell them what questions to ask. And I think there's probably plenty of room in between those two. I think there probably are and will always be things that can be told and shared about what does work, even though every community is different, every family is different, every young person is different. So what have we then, you asked about, what have we tried to do then in this space in the policy world? So I'll start with kind of what we've tried. We work both inside and outside government. So we both support government leaders. We also promote advocacies and advocacy leaders. So we took some of the lessons from the President's Crime Prevention Council, and generally what's happened in pretty much every administration, there comes a point where someone realizes, hey, everything's fragmented. Is there a better way to do that? We have not succeeded in putting in place a permanent entity that would play that role. As Karen, I think you mentioned in the conversation with Marita a couple of weeks ago, there's British Commonwealth countries have an Office of Youth or an Office of Children and Youth, a Ministry of Children and Youth, who plays that connecting role across health and human services and labor and education. And we just don't have one of those at the federal level. And we've tried in many ways, in many administrations, we've managed to get White House task force set up, White House council set up, but always at a time limited thing. And the way that it's just baked into how government is structured in other countries, we don't have it. And so back when we were fortunate to be able to do more international work, a lot of people would come and think the United States must be good at things, so they wanted to know what to do. And we'd say, actually, we're behind in a lot of ways where other countries are in this space. We do fortunately have some entities at the state and local level that we've been supporting for probably 2 decades so far, often called children's cabinets or commissions, but permanent things that exist to cut across the various agencies and come up with a comprehensive, cohesive agenda that can hopefully help communities put in place the reasonably complex strategies that it takes to change young people's environments and opportunity structures.
And when we started to look at those, because I remember that we did this, along with Elizabeth Gaines, who was with us then and joined us, we were finding these bodies put in place. But to your point, they were often put in place either as a temporary thing or with a limited goal. So people were understanding fragmentation, but they were still understanding it based on one goal. So, I'm a governor and I, really care about early childhood development. And I understand that early childhood development has to take into account education and health and social services, et cetera. So I'm calling those cabinet members in and saying, I want an agenda that's focused on young kids. Okay, and then the next governor would come in and would pick another topic, and they would put it on the table. It was an interesting process to say, let this thing stay in place. This idea of coordinating, that complexity is there. If complexity is there for any issue, why not create a permanent structure where you can handle complexity of any issue and not recreate the table every time another topic comes up? And it took a bit of work to do that. But once we got that plate spinning, what we were able to do with it, once we really got people to think this is not just about, a time limited agenda that we've come together to solve this problem, but we're really going to think about children's budgets. We're going to think about children's and youth agendas. We're going to think about aligning policies across. We're going to think about different ways to coordinate services. And I started to build those muscles. What next? And how did we get young people involved? I mean, you've always been sort of looking at policy from both sides. We talked on that side. We're advocates, we're young people in this conversation.
Yeah. So much to dig into on all of those things. So, it's part of where having the right questions and then building in the long lists of possible answers. And so instead of a children's cabinet starting with a blank sheet and saying, hey, what do we feel like prioritizing? If we start with the big pictures, here's the realms of children's development, here's the range of ages, here's the range of populations. So you can at least be picking from a comprehensive menu. So you can be more exacting about why you're choosing a particular topic at a particular time. We had lots of different versions of dashboards that we would create that would let you look at the full picture of what's going on and react based on that. And so tried to create the zoom in, zoom out, where you can be intentional about picking a particular issue or silo as a focus, but also keeping the broader amount in mind. So if things start getting better in one area or worse in others, you could zoom in. So yeah, some of the things you mentioned, Karen, is the people who put together children's budgets. It's strange to people who don't work in our field that government has no idea how much they spend on young people. It's just not compiled. Budgets aren't developed that way. There's no way to know, is most of the funding going for prevention programs or health programs or after school programs. And so having a overarching understanding of what the budget is, so you can both have a baseline to hopefully show that the budget goes up over time for children and youth, and to have advocates aware if the budget's going down, but to also be able to prioritize. Coupling children's budgets with children's report cards, where again, if you have a comprehensive look across ages, across populations, across issue areas, a way to look at, all right, where are people getting stuck? Where are we making progress? And if there's an area we're going in the wrong direction on, let's address that in our children's budget and increase support for the areas that people are struggling with. Then on the youth side, obviously a huge passion for me over the years in so many ways. So again, back to the further reflections on paper, we talked about things like creating grassroots citizen constituencies, organizing a Sierra Club for youth, advancing advocacy coalitions, supporting youth organizing, governance, leadership. I would say this is something that we have tried. I've tried both inside and outside of the forum, lots of different ways to move this forward, all of which I feel good about, and none of which has come near to delivering on our goals and aspirations for it. So yeah, I've been compelled for years about the idea of an AARP for youth. Seeing in surveys, there's questions for policymakers of which organizations have the most clout, and AARP and NRA are the top one or two consistently over time. And any related to youth, they're like literally, I've gone through lists of the top 100 and there's nothing really there. So some of the things we've tried over time, we've tried to support youth councils. So these are times when a governor or mayor or legislature says, hey, maybe if we're talking about youth issues, we should have some way to figure out what young people themselves actually think and say about it, and have created youth councils or similarly named thing where you have a cohort of young people who gets to know the children's cabinet, gets to know the governor, the mayor, and can be a voice and perspective on that. We cut our teeth on a lot of these things in New Mexico, where we spent a lot of time with their children's cabinet and their youth council, the New Mexico Youth Alliance. And one of the examples that came out of it was advocates had been saying we need more school-based health centers. The governor's Governor Richardson, his fiscal people were saying, well, we're already paying for county health clinics in those same areas. This is wasteful, duplicative spending. And the governor happened to have a meeting with his youth council then and said, hey, here's what I'm hearing. What do you think? And the young people said, look, we're in a small rural community. If I go to a community health clinic, by the time I leave, the rumors are going to be everywhere that I'm pregnant. And so I'm not going to go. Like, I just don't want that stigma put on me. But if it was in the school and people were naturally going in, I could get this whatever sort of health services I actually need. And the governor said, got it, makes sense. And I think pushed through the largest increase of funding for school-based health clinics in the state's history, I believe. So there really are ways that young people have insights that others don't. That model, it's a very bureaucratic one. You have to be, inside of government, and that's a big part of, that's one good part to move forward. But it's not what AARP does, of also building the movement of young people. And so we created at one time the Youth Policy Action Center, so an online place that young people could go and take action on the issues that they've believed in. That got folded into what's now the Forum Spark Action platform that I'll probably talk about in a little bit. I did a stint outside the forum with an organization called Splash Life that was trying to literally create an ARP for youth and have discounts and support for that. There's some great stuff going on now with it. Hashtag Youth in Government, Youth in Gov, that's pushing forward on this. We still don't have a major powerful advocacy movement for young people. There really is nothing with the clout of an AARP or anything close. So I kind of would give us maybe A for effort on that front, but a C for success to date. And I'm hoping people continue to push forward and try to do this, because I really think the types of policy wins we're going to be able to do are going to be in a whole different category if there's actually some political might and muscle behind them.
So talk a little bit, I'm watching the chat, talk a little bit, and I'll generalize this, about when we say youth. First of all, what's the age span that we're talking about? And we can go to the promise of adolescence and sort of articulate that when we mean youth, we're talking from 10 to mid-20s in terms of just that developmental period. But as we've been doing this work at the state level, the local level, you'll talk more about Spark Action and the organizing work that you're doing. What are the different populations of young people that we're working with? So we have terms like opportunity youth. We clearly are digging in now around racial equity and social justice. What about other young people who have special needs and special interests? How are we really sort of making sure that when we say all youth, we're really getting to all youth?
Yeah, Ian, if you can put up the next slide, I think this gets into it a little bit. So as I was going back and grading our performance on the various things that we've tried to do in unfinished business, the one that I give us the lowest marks are related to what you just asked, Karen. So youth development arguments from the paper. Youth development arguments were made in many ways developed as a response to an implicit double standard. Fix those who are in trouble, develop those who are not. So that was, in suburb would have a enrichment after school program, and an inner city would have a gang prevention program. And so because of that, we intentionally said, let's create normalizing language around around this. So as we reflected back in that paper, the lessons in the past decade suggest that youth populations at the high ends of age and risk continua, older youth, especially those 18 to early 20s, but even the 14 to 17-year-olds and high-risk youth, those young people who are already out of school, engaged in high-risk behaviors, or involved with the courts, were not as well served by the paradigm shift. By advancing normalizing language, all youth are at risk, all youth need support. To gain broader appeal, we may have had the least impact on those we are most trying to help. We're trying to help the most. Recent data, for example, confirm the risks associated with disconnected youth, but this will not happen unless we intentionally prioritize this population. Where I give us high marks is we've now intentionally prioritized that population. What I think if I had a do-over, I might come back to do-over is the idea of, is advancing normalizing language, is that necessarily the right way to go? This for me has really come to the fore with a lot of the thinking over the years by critical race theory, by anti-race, or being an anti-racist, that really challenge this notion of, is neutrality the right way to talk about these things? So let's see a couple things I pulled up. Critical race theorists believe that political liberalism was incapable of adequately addressing fundamental problems of injustice in American society, notwithstanding legislation and court rulings advancing civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, because its emphasis on the equitable treatment under the law of all races, colorblindness, rendered it capable of only recognizing the most overt and obvious racist practices, not those that were relatively indirect, subtle, or systemic. Obliviousness or neutrality are part of white supremacist structure as a society, so neutrality is structurally racist. So these are things that if I had a do-over, I would probably think about different ways to doing that. I think in many ways this is right back to the dilemma I saw in high school, right? White people who feel they don't have a racist bone in their bodies, and yet we're perfectly content to benefit from systems that put in place to perpetuate their advantage. There's great stuff out there now. I mentioned the structural racism. Arnold Chandler's life course framework is amazing at really walking through the generational effects from slavery. On implicit bias. It says my internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to slow.
You froze for a minute, but you're back.
All right. So the work on implicit bias, right, is so important now that anyone raised in the US, the media we consume, the systems we interact with, create implicit biases, and really showing that these racist biases get embedded in the marrow of our bones, rendering the whole notion of not having a racist bone in our body patently false. So we're pushing on that front, on the equity front. We're pushing to get ourselves past our comfort zones. I think ultimately we need to get to a place where we openly acknowledge that we're not going to be able to change the odds for young people of color until we also succeed in changing the odds that police who killed them are held accountable. And these are the type of things that aren't normalizing language and are harder things to have to put on the table, but I think we're going to need to get to. And we also, we're really going to have to navigate our commitment to meet people where we are with also a more recent commitment to be more explicit about telling people where we stand. 2 days ago, the governor of Idaho signed a law prohibiting Idaho public schools, including universities, from teaching critical race theory. Does that mean we're never going to work with someone in Idaho? Of course not. We're still happy to work with people, wherever they are, but we also shouldn't hide the fact that we find that type of action abhorrent. And if by telling some people where we stand, I actually think we're going to get a lot more interest in our work, but some people may then choose, all right, I no longer work with the forum now that they are clear about where they stand and what their values are. And I think we have to be okay with that. And I think we will be okay with that.
Yeah, and this is a journey that the forum is on, as are many other organizations, and it's a journey that we're on, frankly, that will obviously continue to go on with me not at the helm, but I think we are positioned to actively grapple with all of those things just because of the breadth and depth of what the forum does and the number of different places where we work. Where we do have a commitment to meet people where they are, meet leaders where they are, as you said, but learning how to meet them where they are and be transparent about where you are, while also finding a way to support people moving forward, is a big deal. So let's talk a little bit, as we've got about 15 minutes left.
Sure.
Let's sort of bring it up into the present. So, one of your titles is storytelling, not just policymaking. Talk to us a little bit about that side of the work.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and why do you see that connected to policy?
Yeah. So a big part of equity. So what we are really pushing across all of the policy and storytelling activities that we do to center equity much more explicitly. Part of that is handing the baton over to diverse young leaders themselves. And so the forum has this Spark Action storytelling and advocacy platform that really is focusing in on supporting young leaders who are working to rebuild our nation on the foundation of equity and justice. And so really providing young people an opportunity to own their own narrative. So many misunderstandings happen because media depicts young people in some way, television depicts young people in some way, government depicts young people in some way. We need to let young people depict themselves in the way that are actually authentic. And so that's become an increasing focus of our work, is how do we let young people craft their own stories? People use the terms narrative change. And that to me is really letting young people create the narrative about what they see is going on, as well as instead of letting other people craft depictions of what's happening in the communities that are being underserved. Now that folks on this call have wasted nearly an hour listening to me, I think you'd be far better to use an hour going to the Youth Action Hour. If you just Google Youth Action Hour, it should come right up the top, where you're going to hear diverse young leaders say what they think needs to happen in the country. And I just said, what's that? I'm like, they got it. Like, they're on it. We just need to find a way to get out of the way and give whatever connections and resources we have access to young leaders who can actually drive this change forward.
So give us an example of how we're bringing that forward. So we started out with a conversation, a lofty conversation about access into sort of federal policy circles, and now we're talking about sort of narratives created by young people. How do you connect them? What as you're moving forward, how do you bring those authentic voices into the policy spaces, Iowa, federal government, otherwise? What structures and infrastructures are you trying to help support?
Yeah. So at the federal level, the Twitter #YouthInGov movement has been pushing that forward. Probably not to the level of success we'd like to see in the Biden administration so far. But really politically savvy young people. So usually what happens is things related to youth voice get put in the White House Office of Public Engagement, which is essentially their communications arm. So we'll work with youth networks to get them to promote the stuff that we're doing, as opposed to we're going to work with youth networks to figure out what stuff we should be doing. And so Youth and Gov said it's not enough to put someone in the Office of Public Engagement. We do have a great point person liaison for young people in that office, but in the Domestic Policy Council, we need young people. That's the policy development arm of the White House. Young people should be in that. And even in the offices that are hiring political appointees, the Office of Presidential Appointments, we want young people in that, hiring young people into roles across government. So I think it's a great example of a loftier and more ambitious and correct look at not just a token youth council, but actually young people literally built into the fabric of the federal government across lines. Our children's cabinets, likewise, doing great things. We're getting ready to kick off a cohort of children's cabinets who want to support youth participatory research, to really get young people talk to their peers, interview their peers, collect data from and with their peers, and bring it back into the children's cabinet as part of a decision-making structure. And so that notion of connecting evidence, youth voice, put into actually government decision-making processes is another one that I'm hugely optimistic about. Last thing I guess I would say on that front is, as we've done federal advocacy, there was a moment, amazing young leader, Joanne, who was working for us at the time, came back from working the halls of Capitol Hill, teared up from the fact that she was going around talking to all these white people in offices, white people in office, white people, and the only other people of color she saw were the people delivering the mail. And that was, to me, a real light bulb moment of, we need to diversify who has connections with people in power. And so we are gearing up in our work with Opportunity Youth, is instead of hiring DC government relations firms and specialists, not that there's anything wrong with them, we'd rather train young people themselves to become government relations professionals. And so we're getting ready to launch Opportunity Youth Congressional Liaisons, where we train and pay young leaders in congressional districts on how they can become government relation professionals and be the people who build the relationships with government officials rather than working through organizations like ours.
So we've got about 6 minutes left, so we can give a couple minutes back to Ian to tell us what happens next. And let's just come back around full circle to, you started out saying where the forum was when we started, and when we were sitting around the table at the President's Crime Prevention Council, this idea of allied youth fields. And Rita talked about that in the discussion that I had with her. And of course, I've talked about it in why we got the forum started. So as you think about the tools in your current toolkit with your team, how do you use those tools to advance us toward this idea of allied youth fields? And is there anything that feels absolutely pressing to do right now as the American Rescue Plan dollars are coming forth? Are there any sort of short-term goals that you have that you see meeting everybody where they are, but sort of pushing forward in some really specific ways?
Yeah. So a couple things, because I know we're short on time. When I was growing up in this movement, there's a National Collaboration for Youth that had this Washington policy group that brought together organizations, and the first policy that was successful in passing, the Federal Youth Coordination Act, was done by that collaboration of people working forward. So I saw how you could get 5, 8 people from across organizations working together can pass federal legislation. And we talked about that in the unfinished business paper as well. The Washington Policy Group doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So there really is a gap in the field where we need, and it's been partially played and filled in part by various efforts underway, but I still feel we need that again. We really need a national collaboration for youth that's bringing people together. What is happening right now with the COVID legislation is off the charts amount of funding, the likes of which we'll probably never see again. I'm pretty old by now and haven't seen anything like it. I was in a call with Alan Zuckerman, who founded the National Youth Employment Coalition, this generation before me, and he was just like, I don't know. His son, I think, worked in a Department of Education, and he's like, their budget just tripled, and they don't know what to do with all that that money. So there's a huge opportunity. We are doing everything we can to take our existing work and use it to lean into how the heck do we help communities use this money well and effectively. Older youth, Opportunity Youth, pretty much absent from any of these funding bills. We're pushing as hard as we can with the America's Job Plan, which is billions of dollars for job training. The White House overview on their website of it, I think, had about 11,000 words. Use the word youth once in those 11,000 words. There's no sense right now of a carve out for youth job training programs. We know from the past that if you just give money out for job training programs to whoever wants to use it, youth are always the last in line in that. So there's a lot of advocacy push that we need to do. So the two things of advocacy push for these, now there's the American Families Act proposed as well, massive amount of need for advocacy right now, and massive amount to help communities think of creative, important, impactful ways to use this flood of money that we'd love to think it's always going to be there, but it's not. It's going to dry up in 3 years. And so you need to build it in a way that you're building something that's sustainable, even when that level of federal money goes away.
Absolutely. And I just want to reinforce for folks in the minute before I give it back to Ian, just the significance of the fact that we do have a table. There is a sort of a springboard table that sort of came together around the potential urgency to figure out how to use the money coming in around summer and recovery and all the money coming through the Department of Education well. But that table is going to be biased towards younger kids, not preschool, but it's going to be biased maybe get up through grade 8. Just because the tension that we have to sort of push towards really looking at school and looking at sort of elementary and early secondary grades. This conversation that Thad started with, that we all started with, we don't have a youth, we don't have a ministry of youth, we don't have a department of youth, we don't have anyone who consistently thinks about youth, pushes into young adulthood, looks across outcome areas, looks across systems, looks across all of the kinds of ways that young people are moving into their journey for success in different ways, and says, how do we address them? So it's absolutely mind-boggling that on the one hand, we've been very successful, and Rita talked about this in her conversation, of for the first time really bringing school and youth development folks to the table together to talk about how can we leverage this summer and these opportunities that we've had because of the disruption in schools. But we haven't been successful at having a broader conversation about those older adolescents and young adults. That continues to be one of the places where we'll give ourselves A for effort, but D for success, and really being able to get that stuck. So I'm going to hand it back to Ian. I'm going to thank you, Thaddeus, for spending half of your life with me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and these conversations will continue. So thanks, folks, for joining us. And Ian, I give it back to you.
First, I get to thank Karen also for being my quarter-century mentor. Everything I've been able to do has been learning from you and how you've been a leader in this space and organization, and couldn't possibly have any bigger impact on my life as you have. So thank you for all you've given me throughout the years.
All right, we'll thank each other and give it to Ian.
And I will thank you both for an excellent presentation and being great coworkers for, I guess, the last 14 years that I've been with the forum. I would just like to say, we very much appreciate everyone who was able to join us for any of these 3 conversations about improving policies, planning for impact, and strengthening practices. And we're going to be continuing those conversations in a little less than 2 weeks at our virtual 8th annual Ready by 21 national meeting, which will take place May 19th and 20th. I put the link in the chat, and we'll also share it with everybody after this session, along with the recording. Today's session was recorded, and we will be sharing that with everybody. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. And thank you again to Thaddeus and Karen.